Beck Lowe. Beck is a workshop facilitator. She has worked closely with David Holmgren of Retrosuburbia, editing, researching and project managing. She is an enthusiastic and experienced permaculture educator, has been involved in permaculture training at all levels, from introductory workshops to postgraduate, for more than 15 years. She runs regular permaculture design courses in Central Victoria, and will once again be a lead teacher on the Rockland Ashram PDC. So let's make her welcome. Thank you.
It's a different bio to the one I submitted, but that's okay. Do I need the speaker? No? What?
It's all good.
It's all good. Excellent. Okay. I would also like to acknowledge the Kulin Nation that we're meeting on, and yeah, pretty excited, but also a bit worried about trying to fit these three amazing concepts into 20 minutes and come up with 3 actions, which was my brief from all. Yeah, no pressure at all. So, been thinking a lot. I mean, luckily they have got very good and strong connections, and they're all very well interlinked concepts. So, just as a start, who has heard of permaculture and knows a bit about it? Great, that's just about everyone in the room. Retrosuburbia, that's pretty close as well. And I could guess that you've all had transitioned since we are at a Transition Convergence. So, they're, one of the things that's cool about permaculture, even though you all know about it, just about, it's Australian. It started in Tasmania in the mid-70s, and it's gone on to see quite a few things, including retrosuburbia and transition. So a lot of the underlying transition thinking emerged out of permaculture thinking. So there's some very strong links there. So in particular, I'm sure a lot of you have seen the Transition Handbook, but I decided I wouldn't go into too much detail just because I assumed a lot of people have read this. And Rob Hopkins, the transition poster boy, has actually written quite a bit in this book about the connections and the way he sees it. So I'm assuming a lot of you will have already read that. If not, it's definitely worth reading. So Retrosuburbia, again, is another offshoot of permaculture, this time directly from David Holmgren, who is one of the co-founders of this concept originally. And that's really refocusing things a lot on, mostly on the suburban area, but what we can do ourselves. So lovely illustrations from Brenna Quinlan. This is representing a nice downshift lifestyle, which is one of the things that'd be really great to promote. So what is permaculture? I think most of you know that. Just a reminder that it's not necessarily about food growing, although food growing is a pretty cool part of it. And Nick's just given us some great things to think about in terms of food growing. So yes, a lot of the original permaculture concept was around food growing and how we can create sustainable agricultural systems. But it's also bigger. It's very much about systems thinking. And when I talked to Paul about, this is the, stream, the technology, not quite the technology, the technique stream. Thinking, okay, how do we fit in here? But the permaculture thinking, I think, does fit in here because it is about systems thinking, about learning from nature, understanding how things are connected and what works and why it's worked, and thinking about connections rather than specific elements. And that sort of thinking can be applied, yes, to food growing, but to so many other areas of life. So again, I've taken a quote from the Transition Handbook. You'll all appreciate this because you know what it is. Permaculture is something notoriously difficult to explain in a single sentence. It resists an off-the-cuff definition, which is why trying to fit it into 20 minutes is difficult. There's an in-joke, it takes 72 hours to explain. That's the length of a permaculture design course. So yeah, quite complex, but with an amazing array of tools that we can potentially use in all areas of our life. So go on, Rod Hopkins, and so okay, a design system. for the creation of sustainable human settlements. So it's got that consciousness, the conscious design. It's got systems thinking, and it's all about all the things we need as humans. Food being a really big one, but we have a whole lot of other human needs and how we can actually do that sustainably. So even though you've all heard about it, if you haven't actually done much reading, I'd recommend looking into permaculture a bit closer. I was very tempted to actually start going through the permaculture design principles and relating them to the transition movement. But again, I realised that's something Rob Hopkins has already done in here. And I also realised that would take way longer than 20 minutes. But in terms of systems thinking, I think it is a particularly useful tool. If you're not already aware of this, permacultureprinciples.com is a great starting point. Permaculture Victoria's got these posters downstairs if you want to have a more leisurely look at lunchtime. But they're ideas that make sense of life and how we design things and how we plan things, all based in an ethical framework. Care of the earth, care of people and fair share. So you could, in theory, apply these design principles to some really nasty, horrible multinational business and it might help them out. But what differentiates it is that they're also based in these ethics, so they work together. So we've got some quite general things in there, so just to pick out one or two. Observe and interact, it's that little tree person icon up there. It's really reminding us that we've got to look at what's happening in nature, see what works and think about it, but also that we're not a standoff observer. We're actually part of everything. We need to interact with things. We've got to be in there thinking, trialling, tweaking, really being in our systems rather than having that step back. So there's a whole lot of little things in there. Things like produce no waste, perhaps a bit more intuitive in terms of, the craziness that sees, food scraps as a waste product rather than a resource, with simple transformations through worms or chickens or composting systems to create them into, a much needed product. So a lot in there. And I'm really tempted to keep going, but I won't. Okay. So Retrosuburbia is really focusing on community aspects as well as practical and the built environment. So here's a book. I realised I brought up a range of books and didn't actually bring up Retrosuburbia. It's like that. It's big and thick. If you haven't seen it, it's colourful, relatively easy to read. But what it does is really break down what we could do to make a more resilient and sustainable society now. So one of the big things is retrofitting. It's getting away from that idea that's a lot of mainstream sustainability has, where, okay, we've got to build the new, big, better thing and we've got to come up with the next technology and it's all about, different built systems and the new, whereas David Holmgren in this argues we've actually got enough building stock, for instance. We don't need more buildings. We just need to use them more sensibly. There are a whole lot of things we do in buildings that might not continue into an energy-descent future, like dog watching saloons. We could use that space. Big financial offices, maybe we could use that space, but also just in our households. There's so many houses that are too big for the things that people do in them. So taking in a border, for instance, is one of the key retro-suburban actions. If you've got spare space, it makes sense to have more people in more buildings. So I particularly like this one. This is an inner city Melbourne retrofit where someone said, yep, I love that inner city Melbourne lifestyle. This is really, really where I want to be. But I also realise I want to grow a lot of my food and have garden space. So they did the opposite to a normal renovation and actually took out part of their house to give themselves more garden. And that's left them with their toilet sitting on the back veranda, which I think is amazingly cute. And it's not as exposed as it looks. There's windows that way, but there aren't the other way. And it's actually a lovely place to use the toilet. And it is undercover. So sometimes that retrofitting requires a bit of creative thinking But let's use what we've got. New things, I don't need to tell you, take more resources, more emissions. The more we can tweak, the better. So we particularly think of this in terms of building, but don't think of it just in terms of building. We can also retrofit gardens. We can retrofit our lifestyles. Think about, where you're going, what you're doing, how can I give my lifestyle a bit of a makeover. The other thing about Retrosuburbia is the suburbia bit. So suburbia was a bit maligned for a while, like as a totally uncool place to be, but let's face it, most of us are there as Australians. Majority of Australians are in suburbia, majority of kids grow up in suburbia, and there's some pretty cool things about suburbia. It's a sweet spot, as Holmgren likes to call it, between having a bit of space to spread out and grow some veggies and things, and having enough critical mass of people to form community. So instead of thinking about some of the boring aspects of suburbs like lawns and agapanthus and lack of public transport and whatever, and start thinking about, okay, there is a bit of space, there's enough people, there's things that can happen. And often we've got a lot of potential, extra space in our burbs. The other pretty cool thing about it is we've got all these materials that are useful, a lot of waste food, gardening waste and things. It's actually a bit of a hub for resources for building soils, for instance. And we've also got good reticulated water systems for growing food. So in many ways, the suburbs are just an ideal place to grow food, particularly because we also live there. It's way better to go out in the garden and pick your food than it is to go to the supermarket, I can assure you. There's some nods there, great. And the other thing about suburbia, which gets into the, let's talk about this, what we're talking about in this session is how we get there, is a lot of things are replicable. There's a lot of similar houses in neighbourhoods. If you do one thing at your place, it's quite likely that the neighbours will be able to do a similar thing. So a lot of these things, they don't need a big education program or some top-down response or something. It's something you've done here. Okay, the neighbour looks over the fence and says, okay, I might give that a try, and they give that a try. So these ideas can spread really easily. A bit like solar panels being a bigger example. They've been taken up on individual roofs in a much bigger way than was ever anticipated. They're quite, they're small. A change that people can make, it's easy to see. They can think, oh yeah, my roof's like that, I'll give that a try. So it's a great reason to be, chatting to your neighbours, being out there, growing food in your front yard as well as your backyard, to have those chats and just opening up conversations. And I think, permaculture, retrosuburbia and transition all have this positive can-do basis about them. They don't focus too much on the negatives. Yeah, sure, we know there's a whole lot of really, really bad stuff going on. We're really, we're really hitting the crunch time. But one of the things I think is really useful when going out and talking about this is actually that you can make a better life. Like, people don't necessarily want to be commuting for an hour a day and doing this job and having a mortgage and this, that and the other thing. So if we can really talk about, okay, it's really cool to spend time with your family. It's great to spend time outside. Hey, it'd be great to have a duck in the backyard. All these amazing things. And I think in terms of technically how we get somewhere, really pushing those positives is useful. And I think that's why the permaculture movement has been so successful, although over these decades the transition movement has just grown into this global phenomena, but also Retrosuburbia, that they all push this, hey, it's actually a better world we're creating, it's not a worse world, which tends to be another of those mainstream myths we've got running. We're all going to have to take a step back, and won't it be terrible if we don't get an updated iPhone every couple of years? Okay, there's really cool things in life that don't require money. So, Retrosuburbia is divided into 3 fields. Got the built field. What are we going to do with buildings and things? So, we've already talked retrofitting as a useful tool. This is a yurt, which is a pretty cool structure that's actually in someone's backyard. Decided that they wanted a bigger household but didn't have enough room, so let's pop a yurt in there. So Larger household sizes are a really useful action. So there's all sorts of things we could do. So catching and storing resources is another one. Thinking about water tanks, how we actually get some of that waste material to our place to improve the soil. How do we actually reticulate that water? How do we have a house that stays, cool in summer and warm in winter? If anyone's wondering, Hills hoist, it's just in case toddlers fall in. I think with kids, it's a bit of a safety thing. It's not a newfangled wash your clothes and dry them at the same time. This is another retrofit here. This is Rosemary Morrow, who's a well-known permaculture educator and author, has retrofitted her back shed to make it livable for people to come and volunteer and help out with their time. Another way of increasing household size. So just an example of one of the designs. So these are Brenna's watercolours. Brenna's here, if you want to go and say hello to her at some stage. Putting a greenhouse on the north side of the house. It's one of the more major things. You probably can't do it if you're renting, but it's a great way to give you an indoor-outdoor space, grow food, start food, but also to relax on a cold day. So it ticks a whole lot of different boxes. So this is why coming up with a few neat actions is really difficult. There's so many great ideas out there. And not all of them need you to be a house owner. There are rental ideas as well. So we've got the biological field, which is all around, the food growing, keeping animals, urban forestry, three big themes. So food growing's obviously been one of the big ones for permaculture, but taking it out into the backyard, how can we do that exactly? Can we include animals in our systems, whether it's, guinea pigs that mow the lawn, but also provide some good education and pleasure to your kids or you? I mean, this is actually adult pet guinea pigs, and they are the most cared for guinea pigs ever. This is a cute little Ballarat suburban yard. But another theme on a slightly bigger scale is urban forestry, and how we're going to keep our urban areas cool, but also potentially a source of fuel, having that wood turning over and performing ecosystem functions. So one of the big themes from that is garden farming, growing food in your backyard or your front yard, as opposed to out in the farm. Peri-urban areas, of course, very useful, as we just heard, but there's also that space of just in your backyard that's useful. So on a human scale, small-scale intensive systems that provide primarily for household needs. Doesn't mean you can't go and share some with the neighbours. That's all good too. The behavioural field. This is a really big one, especially for renters and people who aren't in such secure accommodation. Like, not everyone can do things with their house, but everyone can do something with their behaviour and changing mindset. So big ones in there include, being at home more often, having a bigger household, actually having a critical mass where you can look after yourself and be a bit more resilient and sustainable. So diet's in there. The concept of a non-monetary economy is a really important one, how much we actually do for ourselves rather than going out and pay for it. So much of our economic expansion was actually, things that weren't normally in the workforce being pushed out into the workforce, like takeaway meals. It's in the monetary economy when we go to Macca's, but it's not if we pick the food in our garden and produce it in the home. Okay, here's my actions. So the brief I was given for Paul was developing powerful and effective plans and system thinking and come up with a maximum of 3 actions. So this is what's given me a lot of thought over the last few days, how to actually come up with my favourite 3. So number 1, I've themed them roughly along those built biological behavioural lines, is to retrofit what we have. So instead of new build, so this is an example of infill development, which some sustainability commentators say is the useful way to go because we need to squash more people in. Actually, that's just building over productive growing land. The same as in peri-urban areas when we've got large swathes of it. It's the same in backyard areas where we could be growing our own food. So rather than new builds, retrofitting what we have for things like creating space for bikes, more people, more areas for growing, you know, using our composting toilets or water systems. Can't resist just quickly putting that in, even though I'm out of time. I think this is one of the best retrofits I've ever seen. It came from a kid's book in the 80s. Okay, second action, grow food where people live. So that might be your backyard, might be your neighbour's backyard if your backyard's a bit too shady. It'll certainly be the peri-urban areas around suburbs. But basically it reduces transport costs, reduces waste, it makes a productive use of all the food scraps. They're actually where people are eating their food, and it promotes a local diet and a seasonal diet, which can actually be really interesting. We think we've got a diverse diet because everything's there all the time, but that's actually no diversity. A seasonal diet, you really look forward to the first peaches of the season. And finally, work less, buy less and enjoy more. So getting away from that idea of having to earn money and having to spend money, and that's a theme a lot of you will have seen, the art of frugal hedonism. So the art of frugal hedonism. So that's a really good one to really promote the positives, to say, okay, I don't want to be working so much. I actually want to work less and not even worry too much about sustainability and resilience. That should follow, but just promote the idea that, you know, if we're not spending all our time travelling, we can spend more time with the kids. If we downshift to a smaller house, we don't have to worry about the mortgage, and we can spend time, you know, preserving food, growing food, chatting with friends, throwing amazing dinner parties with the produce that we created, and then we can sit down and read a book so we don't have to stress too much. So there's your promotion. And we're at 20 minutes? Yes.
Thank you so much.
No worries.
Thank you.